Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. As always, I'm Captain Sidaris, but this time without Seven Saturn. He told me that he's a software developer and not a fighter pilot, so I replaced him with a pilot ace from Wing Commander 4. Hi Owen, thanks for joining me.
Hello Captain, thank you for inviting me.
Of course, we are not alone today. Joining us is Random Starfighter, a longtime player of the X-Wing games, and Jedi, one of the developers of the game. Hi guys, how are you doing?
Hello, doing great.
Doing great. How are you guys doing?
Well, here in Austria, we are melting currently, but not too bad.
That's great. I'm in the Seattle area right now, and we had a little bit of warm weather, but it's cooling off for the weekend. So I'm enjoying the cooler weather.
I'm East Coast USA. It's kind of hot up here, but it's not bad.
I'm in London where the weather will not make up its mind.
Okay, I would say before we start to go to the main topic, maybe you can introduce yourself to the audience.
I guess I'll go ahead and I'll go first. I'm Jedi. That's always been the handle and the call sign that I have used for years and years and years when it comes to flight action games. As you mentioned, I was a developer on X-Wing versus TIE Fighter, as well as X-Wing Alliance. Prior to that, and after that, I've worked as a developer in the games industry for probably the last 20 years or so, until recently. I am now a instructor at a university that focuses on game development and game development education. And so even though I'm not doing active development anymore, I'm still kind of have a hand in the industry, just because, again, I teach game design now full time. Prior to getting a job working on X-Wing versus TIE Fighter, I was, I guess, part of the community that had sprung up around X-Wing and TIE Fighter, and I kind of got my foot in the door because I made a lot of levels. I made a lot of missions with, whatever mission editor I could find, and kind of cut my teeth on those and shared them around with friends in the community. And through a series, I suppose, of interesting and convenient coincidences, I managed to kind of be at the right place at the right time to get my foot in the door with Totally Games, the developers, and I got hired to work on X-Wing versus TIE Fighter, and I've been in the industry ever since. And that's me.
It's always such a delight to hear about anybody in any industry who manages to break in through a genuine personal interest.
Yeah.
It's the best way to run to just fall into or push your way into a career in your life, isn't it? To act, and then, because of course, what's the old saying? If you find a job you genuinely enjoy, you never work a day in your life.
Absolutely, and I feel that's totally true. Yeah. And what's funny too is, even though I've been teaching full time at a specific game-related university, I'm actually giving a talk at PAX Prime the end of the summer, as part of a panel about how you can get into games without needing an education. So even though I'm full-time employed as, it's what I do for a living, right? I try to get people to come to the university and learn how to do game design. I'm also happy to share with people, like, you don't need a degree to do this. So that's I don't know whether it's whether I'm biting the hand that feeds me or not, but I still think it's an important, it's important information to get out there, because I think for a lot of people, right? I mean, all of us, right, are really big into games, and we love gaming, but there's a smaller subset of us that want to do it for a living, and I don't think there's enough information out there on how to get started, right? So just always happy to share my experience with folks.
Fantastic.
And what about you, Random?
Yeah, I am Random Starfighter. I guess most people call me Random or Rando. I've been playing these games for a long time, since I was maybe 12, I don't know when they came out, but I've been familiar with these games for a long time. Not so much XVT. The first time I played it, I hated it because it was very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
But around 2015 or so, which is pretty modern considering how old these games are, I decided I'll get the game, I'll give it a shot, and I really liked it. And I eventually got into the community, started playing some multiplayer games around 2017, and it's quickly become one of my favorite games. I'm fairly heavily involved in the community. I guess. I'm around. I do a little bit of mission design, hacking, reverse engineering, a little bit of modding, So I know my stuff around these games on kind of the mechanical level, the engine level, and I have a lot of flight experience, and I know how to play the games. I know all the mechanics, that kind of stuff.
May I please call you Rando Calrissian?
Random Galaxy.
Yay!
If you really want to.
I don't know. It sounds kind of long, doesn't it?
Random, I'm sure you probably have a better understanding currently of the mechanics and how things works that I do at this point, because it was so long ago for me that I've worked on it. Like I said, I'll try to remember as much as I can to share with you all.
Yeah, like if anyone's like familiar with this series, they probably know about X-Wing Alliance Upgrade and all of like the heavy stuff that they're doing over there. I'm not as heavy with that, but I know my way around XVT, and I'm probably the closest thing to a modern developer for it, I guess.
Well, I would say it's time to answer the question of the day. What is Star Wars X-Wing vs TIE Fighter? Basically, it is a space combat game from 1997 in which you can decide if you fly for the Rebel Alliance or the Galactic Empire. Unlike its predecessors X-Wing and TIE Fighter, the vanilla version of the game didn't include any story-driven campaign. That came half a year later with the expansion Balance of Power. But even without the campaign, players don't have to fly with 7 totally strangers to enjoy the game. Every mission is available for single or multiplayer, but sadly I have to say the official multiplayer support ended around 2006. But luckily again, we have an amazing feature here called LAN mode. So you can still play this game via a VPN. Most players use for that Game Rangers. If you don't find any players or need help with the game, I can always recommend the community Discord. And since I have 2 guys here from the community, maybe you can tell us a little bit how the community is currently active.
I know for myself personally, I've been a member of the Renegade Wing community. I don't get much of a chance to interact with a lot of the other groups out there. My involvement with Renegade Wing kind of stems way, way back. I mean, I think Renegade Wing on Discord evolved from that original community that I was a part of, like way back when X-Wing came out in like 1993. And that community evolved from like the flight sim forum on CompuServe, like kind of before there was the internet, right? And we've just kind of stuck together as a group. So I was part of that group as a fan first and foremost, and actually one of the things that was kind of thrilling for myself as well as the other members there was a lot of the original members. There are not a lot of us left, but those of us who do kind of trace our roots back to being fans of X-Wing and TIE Fighter, you know, they kind of got to see my journey from going as a fan to getting a job, you know, on the development team. And so they're still really active. They still tend to play Squadrons more than they play X-Wing Alliance or XVT. Again, I haven't played XVT online in forever. I mostly have played Squadrons with those guys. And so the actual technical setup for you know, VPNing and connecting, I'm not up to date with what those current methods are, but maybe the other guys can speak to that a little bit more.
Off topic, sorry guys, but I bought Squadrons when that came out, when that was new, and I played it a couple of times. I was mostly interested in trying it out in VR, and I found I had exactly the same problem, which is that all my muscle memory is geared to Wing Commander.
Sure.
And I played it maybe 3 times, kept getting blown up because I kept trying to do things that didn't work in this game, and eventually gave up on it, which is horrendous because it's a gorgeous looking game and it played really well. I could not remember my keys. I think Wing Commander has just ruined me for all other spaceflight sims.
Right on. That's funny.
And Random, do you have any insights into the community currently?
The current community, it's mostly the old clans and gaming groups that are still around. There's a few of them, like Jedi's and Renegade Wing. There's Rebel Squadrons out there.
Right.
Emperor's Hammer is a big one. The TIE Corps. They're one of the larger ones that are more active. I was a member there a few years ago, but I kind of get burned out of that because there's a lot of competitions and stuff that they do, and it's a lot to keep up with. Most of the communities, I think, have moved on to Squadrons since that was the big thing that came out, but occasionally they do play XVT.
Yeah.
I think they do. I haven't really been into their multiplayer stuff for a few years now.
Yeah, I know some of the folks in Renegade Squad. As I don't know if they've kept it up more recently. And again, I don't get as much time to spend on Discord as I would always like. But for a while, they were doing, I think, playing once a week. Like I think on like either Friday or Saturday evenings, they would specifically fire up XVT or X-Wing Alliance. And I know there are folks who would like to do that more in our group. And I'm not trying to necessarily promote the group exclusively, but it's the only one that I've really kind of been a part of. And so if there are new players, and again, Emperor's Hammer, I know they've been really, really active for many, many, many years. And so again, I'm not a member of their community, but if you're looking to get involved with these games, I think those would be really good places to start.
And there's another one that's active that's called the Rebel Alliance. And
Rebel Alliance, yeah.
they're still kind of active. I think they're running a competition right now for XVT, but they do occasionally host some games and they have some things going on for that. Whenever I do catch a game, it's usually those guys who are playing.
Ordinary, I would also summarize the history of the game, but sadly I couldn't find that much about the development of the game. What I found is a really epic article about the difficulties the team had with the implementation of the multiplayer code to the already existing game code. I would say that's a must read for everybody who wants to know a little bit about netcode and especially the difficulties the developers had in the 90s. But maybe Jedi, you can tell us a little bit about the history and how this whole thing started.
I definitely can, and I think I have, again, coming from the community that was very active in both X-Wing and TIE Fighter. One of the things that, again, if anybody from those older communities is listening to this, that really kind of cracked me up in a lot of ways too. And I felt this way even before joining the team, but for a long time, those communities, especially after TIE Fighter came out, a lot of the talk online was like, they should just add a patch that makes it multiplayer. Like, why don't they just patch TIE Fighter? Just right? It'll just be a downloadable patch that we apply and then we can all play. I joined, oh God, what was it? I joined the development team in, I think, July of 1996. Yeah. So I joined Totally Games in July of 96. They had already been working on that game, for probably 8 months prior to my joining the team. And then we continued to work on it for like another year. I think it came out in spring of 1997. I'm not sure about the specific article that you mentioned, but like, oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, even on a low latency LAN where we were testing some of the multiplayer code, right? I mean, it was hard, y'all. It's not something you could just patch and then have it work, right? I mean, you need a whole front end and a UI that supports it. You need a way to connect with each other. One of the multiplayer tests that we would frequently do, right? And think back to like the network speeds. I mean, so many people are on fiber now, right? And gigabit, and or multiple megabit fiber, for their internet providers. I mean, we were working on like a 56K modem was really fast at the time. So one of the tests we would often do, I mean, again, being in the Bay Area, was that Fridays around 5 o'clock, after 5 p.m., when the rest of the world got off of work and went home, everybody would then, at the end of the day, they would go home and they would log into America Online or Prodigy or CompuServe or whoever their service provider was. And so network traffic on a Friday night at 5 p.m. was when it was at its highest in the Bay Area. And so, everyone looks forward to going home at 5 o'clock on a Friday, but the development team, that's when we would get to work, right? We'd be like, great, we can stress test our network code.
Yeah.
Right. And check for packet loss, check for desynchronization, like all this sort of stuff, right? A lot of the network code too had to be predictive of players' input, right? And some of the things we would experience, that's where you have rubber banding, where the code predicts that you're going to go this way, but then you get the packet back that says, oh no, they actually turned this way, and then suddenly you got to, move the ship back to where it actually is versus where it thought it was going to be. And I just remember so many late Friday nights. I mean, yeah, we'd order pizza for the whole development team, and we'd be there super late into the night, just stress testing it, and just like week after week after week to get it honed and fix bugs and to optimize the code. But yeah, it was it was not easy work. And again, I'm not one of the coders. I'm more of a designer than a programmer. Um, but I know some of the principles behind what we were doing in the code, and it was, I mean, again, we were, I think in some ways, I mean, the game was fitting for its time because multiplayer was becoming more popular. I also think too, I remember what the other Wing Command, there was a Wing Commander game that came out around that time too, where you could just dial up and reach, dial somebody else's modem and connect directly to do kind of head-to-head battles and stuff. And again, I mean, there were other games. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, it was kind of on the cusp of, as the industry started to turn more towards those kind of multiplayer games and playing over the internet. And really the original game itself, the engine itself was never designed to be multiplayer. So, right, when there was a whole new layer of code that had to be put in there to account for that. So yeah, it was a real challenge. And again, when I look back on it, I'm like, wow, that was a really a hell of an accomplishment for us to to make I mean, really what we did was we just took a big enough hammer to make it work. And I remember having a conversation with Larry Holland, who's the creative director, owner of Totally Games, when we were working on X-Wing Alliance. And some of the code in X-Wing Alliance can be traced back to and existent from, I think, Battlehawks 1942 or Secret Weapons of the Luftwaffe was an earlier Lucasfilm game before Lucasfilm was even LucasArts. So I mean, like, there was some legacy code in that game that still was part of the core engine, right? So again, it was taking an engine that was never designed to do what we made it do and make it work well enough where it could support it. So that's my memory of of at least the 8 or 9 months that we worked, that I got to work on that before we shipped.
I can imagine all of that being an absolute headache.
It was fun as hell though to work on, for sure.
Well, there's the camaraderie that comes out of working on a team like that versus the actual work.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Everybody from Totally Games, even though we've been scattered to the four corners of the earth. I mean, and then literally scattered to the four corners of the earth. I mean, they're still my family to this day, even though it's 25, almost 30 years later. I still love them. They're still great folks. I still keep in touch with a lot of them.
That's spectacular.
I mentioned it many times during our play session to Owen that it's unbelievable for me that back in before 1997, before the release, that there is a development studio who thinks, hey, let's do a multiplayer focused game with the speeds of a 56k modem. It's just mind-blowing for me all the time.
I think even as late as 1997, I was still on a 28.8.
Yeah, yep. That's what I had at home. 56k was too expensive. I couldn't afford that. So there were times too, I remember, that we would go home and we would play on weekends. And as a matter of fact, later into development, when everyone else would stay to play over 56k lines, there were a couple of nights that I left to go home and play over my 28.8 modem to see how well it worked with other people who were actually still at the studio. I mean, there were times literally we would go home on Friday, like, everybody go home and then log in and we're going to play for a few hours. Well, a few people, some of the programmers stayed behind, right, and were debugging stuff. So that was, again, it was wild. It's like, hey, go home from work and go work somewhere, right? And
so you guys were absolutely well ahead of the crowd on the whole work from home phenomenon.
We totally, absolutely.
Pack leaders.
Yep, that's right. So way back then.
And do you maybe know when the whole project started?
I knew it had started before I joined. I mean, I was actually working in product support at LucasArts at the time, answering phones and doing, helping people make boot disks so they could run the LucasArts games. And so I don't know when development on it started. I'm sure it started pretty quickly after TIE Fighter had shipped. I don't know the precise date, but I think TIE Fighter shipped sometime, I think, in 1995, maybe late in 95. So I would not, again, I wouldn't be surprised if, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if development on XVT started sometime in early 96 or the middle of 96. So I'm sure from beginning to when we shipped was probably a 2 to 2.5 year cycle. And it was a smaller team too. I mean, we were only a team of about maybe about 30 people who worked on it.
Not smaller. Back then, the teams were much smaller, ordinary.
Yeah, I mean, from what I can remember, I mean, yeah, there was the core of us who worked on it was maybe about 20 people, somewhere between 20 and 30, I think, because we had on XVT, it was just myself and Dave Westman, or the infamous Wotan, who made all the levels for it. And we had, I think, 3 or 4 programmers, a whole team, a whole mess of artists, a couple of core QA, but also there were also folks too that even though we were separate from LucasArts, we used a lot of their resources too, like the whole sound department. Totally Games didn't have an audio department or a direct kind of QA department, but they were just really literally across the highway from us. Like we could see LucasArts, their building from where we were. Literally, just look across the highway, and there they were. So again, all of the audio team was internal to LucasArts. All of the QA was internal to LucasArts, as well as some of the other resources. I don't remember how much, but again, those were all developers on it as well, and so there's a lot of coordination between the two studios.
That must have been so exciting as well, because I know I was a massive fan in the 90s. LucasArts were kind of they were the early 2000s Valve of their day, weren't they? They very rarely churned out a stinker. Everything they touched was pure gold. So working with them must have been spectacular.
Yeah, it was. I mean, for me personally, I had been a huge fan of their work, right? I mean, and even now I look back on it, I kind of have to pinch myself. Say, really, did I actually work on those? Like that actually happened, and that was me, right? Because yeah, I was a huge fan of theirs. Yeah, because that's about the same time when Dark Forces came out, and then the Jedi Knight series started to come out, right? Yeah, I mean they that was kind of the golden age, right?
Yeah,
they were fantastic at that time.
Did you maybe even got some sneak peeks before the game were announced or even released?
Oh yeah, I mean, if you work as a developer, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that that's going on that the wider industry is unaware of, right? I can say too that as we were working on X-Wing versus TIE Fighter, there was already some groundwork and concepting going on for what the game after that would be. And even though what eventually became X-Wing Alliance, with the sort of family smuggling story where you fly a YT-1300, right, where you fly a ship like the Millennium Falcon, that ended up being a compromise from the original concept that was being worked on, which was, if you have X-Wing, then you have TIE Fighter, then we were going to do Millennium Falcon as its own standalone game. Right, and that probably doesn't surprise people, because that would have been the next logical step. But it was really ambitious, which I appreciate as a studio. Right, you don't want to stagnate. You don't want to just keep doing the same thing over and over again. You want to increase your skill and your challenge when making a game. But they had concepts where you would again kind of land on planets and get out of the ship, and it would almost be. I mean, it sounds like a fantastic game, right? I mean, like it would almost be a combination of the X-Wing series along with what would be done in Dark Forces or anything like that, right? Where you would fly and fight like you do in X-Wing, but then go and run and gun on, in a traditional first-person shooter. And at the time, late 90s, it was just way over scoped. And so instead, that's, we kind of scaled that back, reworked some of the concepts, and then incorporated. We still wanted to fly a freighter, and so that's why the kind of family storyline that that exists in X-Wing Alliance was kind of an evolution and a compromise from that initial idea. And I think I knew. I mean, I knew about Jedi Knight before it was announced, right? Because I mean, we're over at LucasArts all the time, and right. I mean, and you've already signed. I mean, if you work for any of those companies, you already sign a non-disclosure agreement, right? So you can't tell people that what you see and what you're working on. And so yeah, I mean, I knew about Jedi Knight, and and a lot of the other games, like some of the what was it? Not the no, the Sam and Max game came out before that, but some of the adventure games that they were doing, some of the later ones in the late '90s, I knew about those before they were announced, which was kind of cool. I mean, that's one of the benefits of kind of working behind the curtain, right? You get to see everything that's going on before they get announced, and that's kind of I guess a perk of working in the industry.
Going a little bit back to the whole team, I wonder how many of the original core developers from X-Wing or TIE Fighter switched over to X-Wing versus TIE Fighter?
Pretty much the whole team. I think one of the level designers kind of moved on and left the company, and I think that's where the opening came up for me to join. But really, a lot of the core team through that whole entire series of games, from X-Wing all the way to X-Wing Alliance, we picked up more people as we went and as we grew. The team expanded, but it's pretty much the core. At least I should say, I'm not aware of anybody who worked on the original X-Wing that also didn't kind of follow through all the way to X-Wing Alliance. I mean, as a matter of fact, one of the things I remember is when X-Wing came out in '93, and I just bought it as a fan, that it came with a book called the Farlander Papers, and at the very, very end of that book, it had a list of the development team with their photos and their bios, and and they to me, again, like being a fan, like they were my heroes, right? I idolized these people, and all of them were people that I worked with on XVT and X-Wing Alliance, right? So like that core group of people were all on the team when I joined, and continued to be on the X-Wing team. We had another internal team at Totally Games that was working on a completely other, almost like a Sid Meier kind of historical game, which was a kind of a passion project for the head of the studio, because he was actually, in addition to being a programmer, he had his degree in archaeology, and so that aspect fascinated him. And while that game never saw the light of day, there was another whole team at the studio that was working on that. And actually, before I left, we were working on a kind of interesting flight action game that we were going to do with Microsoft, that we had a whole demo built around, but again, that never got final approval. And that's not uncommon, right? I mean, studios make a lot of demos and a lot of prototypes that they pitch that never go anywhere, and then just kind of eventually piddle out and die. And so we were no different, right? I mean, X-Wing, I think, and those games were kind of the bread and butter of that's what kept the lights on and allowed us to kind of pursue some other ideas that never really came to fruition.
Talking about features maybe which didn't make it because the engine couldn't handle or it was too complicated, can you remember anything?
Well, it's something that eventually came, and I think we have it in I think we had it in Alliance, and even then I don't remember for sure because it's been a while since I played it. One of the things we wanted to do was multi-crew, where you could have someone fly and somebody else shoot. I know you can swap positions in X-Wing Alliance on the YT-1300. I don't remember now, and again, it's the game I worked on. I don't even remember whether it shipped that way or not. But that was something I knew that we really wanted to do for X-Wing versus TIE Fighter. The other thing that we really wanted to do too, that we never got around to implementing in any game, was that, especially in the match nature of XVT, right? If once you run out of ships, right, you're just kind of sent to like, okay, well, now you're just an observer, right? One of the things we really wanted to do is that if there's a capital ship on your side, so let's say you're flying a TIE fighter and you only have 3 TIE fighters total and you lose all 3, but the match is still going on, but let's say it's all coming from a Star Destroyer, one of our thoughts was like, oh, we'll put you like, maybe you can control a turbo laser, right? Like you're in a turret on the Star Destroyer and you can still participate, only you're not flying around. You're just kind of stuck shooting at people as they go by, much kind of like, you would if you were a gunner on a B-17 or something like that. So instead of being in the P-51, well, now you're just a gunner on another ship that's out there. We did some early tests with that, but like again, like having multiple people on one ship, especially with latency on a 56K modem, was just too much. Like it was just, we just couldn't realize it because it was too unstable. But again, just a couple years later, on X-Wing Alliance, again, I don't quote me that you can actually multi-crew a ship, but I know that was something we wanted to do. I just don't remember whether we shipped it with that support or not. I feel like I should know the answer to that, but I really don't remember.
Well, all these were amazingly advanced ideas to be attempting to roll out, especially at the time, because I mean, things like multi-crews, being able to fly around, then land and explore. Yeah. These are concepts that really only just started emerging properly, fully fledged out in games in the last 5 or 6 years, aren't they? I mean, I know right. Elite Dangerous brought in a couple of expansions that did along those lines, and of course, everyone knows about No Man's Sky. But that kind of level of complication is only in the last 5 years or so been really coming to the fore, hasn't it? So you guys were really pushing the barriers and the expectations back then.
Oh, we wanted to do it all, right? I mean, there's no kind of limit on what the only limit was what the technology would allow, right? And the technology and internet speed would allow. I mean, and even like you said, I mean, like both Elite and No Man's Sky and Star Citizen, like all of those games that do that stuff now. I mean, I love those games, right? I mean, that's always kind of been the goal for me, right? Like that's the games I've always wanted to make and play. Mm-hmm. So I'm thrilled that we have that ability now, right? And it's something we wanted to do, but again, we just didn't have the ability to pull it off at the time.
You're just too damn pioneering.
That's right. You can only pioneer so much for one day.
Okay, then I would say before we switch to the pros and cons, I would like to know maybe if the team was happy with the release.
I think we were. I think the biggest. Well, even kind of speaking, honestly, I think this kind of leads right into the pros and cons, right? I mean, just the fact that we made a game that did what it did. I mean, we made what we set out to do, a multiplayer X-Wing and TIE Fighter experience. And this is something that's really challenging as a developer, and something I even tell my students currently is that it's very easy, like when you set out to do something that is technically hard, and you accomplish that thing that is technically hard, I think, and this is just my own personal opinion, I don't know if other people on the development team would feel differently, but I think we became kind of enamored with the fact that we did it, right? That we accomplished what was really hard technically to do, and felt satisfied with that without having a lot of foresight what the community was expecting, right? I mean, we had these really deep story games that had a really strong narrative through line in both X-Wing and especially in TIE Fighter, with the whole kind of hidden path of being the Emperor's personal servant, right? I mean, like that was really, I mean, that's what made those games really engrossing, was a fantastic flight model and a really engrossing story. And I think that when we made X-Wing versus TIE Fighter, I mean, there was no narrative thread in it, right? In the original vanilla release. It's just, here's a collection of missions that you can play. And none of them were really related to each other in any sort of narrative way. And I think I know we were satisfied with what we did. I mean, we did, and we knew how hard it was to do and to have that be accomplished. So initially, before we did the expansion that had the balance of power story levels, I think we very rightly so came under a lot of criticism from the community that, like, this isn't what we wanted. Where's the story? And so I think that's probably one of the biggest cons to the game, in addition to it being a con that there was no real easy kind of on-ramping to the game. If that was the first game in the series that you picked up, I mean, you were kind of thrown to the deep end to kind of figure it out, right? There were no training missions, no things that kind of walked you through anything. It's just literally, hey, get in, play, figure it out. And so, again, I think, like, I know, and I'm still to this day, I'm super proud of my work I'm really proud of the missions that I made, the work that we did on it. But yeah, I think it definitely led to, and I don't think it was necessarily hubris on our side, but I think it was just that feeling of accomplishment and how difficult it was to make multiplayer work, that we were a little short-sighted in what the community was expecting, and we didn't really, in that sense, we didn't give them what they were expecting, and were criticized, right? And I think rightly so, criticized for it.
I think, wasn't it? It was John Carmack, formerly of id, who famously said that story in games is a bit like story in porno. You don't necessarily need it there to enjoy it.
And I think that's generally true, right? I mean, and actually, I know that's true. I mean, there's lots of games that are like, they're just fun games, right? And I agree. I don't think that narrative is essential for player engagement. However, if you're doing the third game in the series where the first two are very heavily narrative focused, I think maybe we could have got out in front of that and set community expectation better than what we did. I mean, also at the time, that wasn't our job as developers, right? And I don't want to lay the responsibility entirely on LucasArts' marketing department, but looking back on it now, I think, oh man, I think if we had only set expectation, because again, people still love the game, right? It still has a pretty dedicated following, and I appreciate that. But again, if I could go back and do anything different, it would be to either message expectation and manage expectation better before the release, or delay the release a little bit longer so we could include something like balance of power inherently in it. So we would still have, well, here it's a collection of missions, plus here's the sort of storyline aspect of it. Kind of like Squadrons, right? I mean, Squadrons has a campaign that you follow that goes back and forth between the two. And so in that sense, I like the way that Squadrons handled it, because it's still, hey, it's just match play, but you can also follow a story if you want.
I think, to be fair to XVT at the time, for multiplayer, I mean, back in the day, games like Doom and Quake were popular, especially on the multiplayer side.
Right.
So, I mean, XVT brought you deathmatch in space, like you can do that. And
Yep.
It's just that it had such a strong single player route. That's what a lot of people were expecting, was
Right.
something more from the single player carried over into multiplayer.
Totally. I think we learned a lot from that, and that definitely influenced some of what we did and some of the choices we made when developing X-Wing Alliance, right? I mean, I think every time we released something, we took that feedback and we're like, okay, here's how we can make the next one better, And I think you're right. I mean, it's true that so many of the other games were just like, well, like Quake didn't really have a story, right? It was just, hey, get in and shoot each other.
That's John Carmack again.
Right. Yeah. And that was fine, but like I said, it's interesting to look back on it and kind of armchair quarterback the whole thing.
But I think you really did an amazing job here. Looking back so many years, and it still works. It's still a stable multiplayer experience, which offers better graphics than the predecessors, the same controls. You can decide if you want to play on the Empire side, on the Rebel side. It's just more of everything.
Yeah. That is quite something, actually. When Captain invited me to play a few rounds with him over the last few weeks, I was just straight plugging in my modern HOTAS flight stick. It just worked. It just worked.
That's great.
There was nothing to go around to try and set it up or configure it or anything. It just worked. I did think that was quite, because any time I've played any games that these days would be considered retro, there's almost always some little hoops you got to jump through.
Yeah.
And there was nothing. It just straight worked. It was quite beautiful.
Awesome. That's great to hear.
There are a lot of issues for a lot of people with inputs, though. A lot of people do have trouble setting up their joysticks. So, I mean, it's great that it went smoothly for you, but around the community, I've seen a lot of complaints about people having a lot of trouble setting stuff up.
Yeah, I actually getting my throttle to register has always been a challenge. I think I have to go through and set it up as a single controller rather than dual controllers. So yeah.
Oh well, hush my mouth then.
No, I am glad it, again, like Random said, I'm glad it worked for you. That's fantastic.
Another thing I saw mentioned many times on the internet, that you guys also included a new kind of AI which basically predicts that it's been targeted and makes some evasive maneuvers.
Yeah, I don't remember all of the technical aspects of it, but there was a lot of sort of kind of predictive AI, as well as predictive models that we used in the network code. It could kind of have an idea of where you were. I mean, it certainly knew, the AI on each ship knew when it was being targeted, and it could do evasive maneuvers based off of how long it had been targeted, where you were in relation to it, whether you were in front of it, whether you were behind it. One of the strategies I know that people developed to kind of counteract that was to try to eyeball things, right? Because if you could, because we added countermeasures, I think was a newer feature that came with X-Wing versus TIE Fighter that weren't there previously. Maybe it was part of TIE Fighter, I just don't remember. But as part of that, if the AI knew it was being locked onto, it could start to go into a different kind of mode of flying. And so to get around that, people would just, it's like, okay, well, I won't target it directly. I'll just kind of aim towards it and try to shoot my projectiles at that ship like I would, just one of my regular laser bolts, and just try to lead it enough where I could hit it. Because if I don't target it, it doesn't know I'm coming after it, which is really true, right? And it's like, I'm just going to eyeball it. And people got really skilled at that.
Yeah, from a mechanics side, that's something I've personally seen a lot in the game, is they don't necessarily know if you've targeted them, but they do know if a player is pointed at them. And especially if the AI has taken damage and a player is pointed at them, they'll just start going evasive. And
Yep.
In my community, we called it the Jedi weave. No relation to you, but they would just weave back and forth really quickly, and you just had to predict when they were going to turn and try to cut them off, and that was the only way that you could hit them.
Anyone has some pros? I have a few, but I want also to hear yours.
Well, again, I think one of the biggest pros was just the whole premise of the game, that you could, hop into an X-Wing or a TIE Fighter and just get out there and fight against your friends, right? Because I think the community at that point was pretty large. The community I was a part of, we wrote fan fiction and stuff like that, we wrote stories where we were all in squadrons together, and we wrote fan fiction about the adventures we had. And so being able to actually, because again, there's nothing forcing you in some of those levels or some of those missions to have to go head to head. You could have 4 players on one side and just fight against the AI. So if you're like, oh, I'm in a rebel squadron, I'm not going to fly on the Empire side. Well, me and 3 other friends can just jump into the X-Wing positions and just fly that cooperatively against the AI, right? Do it kind of PvE. And we actually, in a lot of the levels too, as a little bit of insight, we had the ability to tell how many players were on one side versus another. And then many of the levels would try to auto balance towards that. And we kind of had to do that by hand, where I'm like, okay, well, if there are 3 X-Wings that have a player in them, but there's nobody on the Imperial side, then spawn an extra Star Destroyer or create more waves of TIE interceptors that show up. Because again, one of the things that we found, like a single player, again, I remember some of our early tests, was at that point, because I was such a big fan of X-Wing, I could just put myself into a level with a Star Destroyer and no other ships. And I can take that Star Destroyer out solo, in maybe about 7 or 8 minutes, right? And I'm like, okay, great. Well, let's see how long it takes 2 people. So now my office mate and we're going to jump in, and I'll just add a second X-Wing, and we will do 2 live, 2 actual people in X-Wings against a Star Destroyer. And it wasn't 3.5 minutes. It was more like we could take it out in about 90 seconds, right? So we're like, wow. And if we put 4 players against it, the thing didn't even stand a chance, right? So we had to find ways of maintaining balance when there were more people on one side than another, and especially if it was all players on one side and just AI on the other. And so in addition to just the getting the multiplayer code working, the amount of time it took to balance and rebalance all of those missions for lots of different permutations of where players could potentially be on what side and whether it was balanced or unbalanced. That was a lot of work too. And again, one of the things I'm kind of proud of. I would never want to do it that way ever again. It was really a lot of work, and I think there are better automated ways to handle that, in the future. But we literally handcrafted those solutions for each individual mission. And,
so you effectively wrote a massive decision tree.
Yes, that's basically that's
Wow,
exactly
yeah.
what it was.
Yeah.
So you can imagine how much work went into that.
Yeah, I absolutely can. Yeah.
Rounding out some of the pros, I think multiplayer being obviously the biggest one. I think one of the unintended pros, I think, was that player versus environment. The fact that you could cooperate with your friends on a team and just take down AI enemy opponents. That was a huge thing, and that's personally my favorite part of the game. Is because, PvP is very stressful, and you have to have a mindset to really enjoy losing a lot. Like nobody likes getting blown up. So, but the fact that you can play, with your friends in a more casual, relaxed environment and just play against the computer is awesome. And the combat scenarios were all set up that way. So, as you added more players to the game, the enemy would get more difficult because sometimes, as Jedi said, other ships would show up, another Star Destroyer might show up, and you could also play it from the opposing perspective. So it was kind of two missions in one, even though it was the exact same mission.
Right.
You mentioned there's something which I never considered. It's not only a co-op game, but it's also a deathmatch game, but also a co-op and PvP game in one. So basically you can decide really how you want to play this game. There's so many variations, so many different play styles in one game, and that in 1997. So hats off again.
Thank you.
They really tried to get the most out of the multiplayer aspect because they were very creative with what they were trying to do anyway, because they have a lot of their melee situations, which are the PvP missions, have like a starship, what's called a starship turkey shoot, where the players compete on different teams to see how many starships they can blow up or how many transports they can blow up and stuff like that. And they weren't super popular, I guess, but they were trying to make the most of a multiplayer experience and trying to see what you could do with that with your friends.
And we have to be honest, most modern titles don't have so many modes, so many maps. It's a little bit embarrassing sometimes.
Yeah, but to balance that out, they do launch with many, many more bugs.
Yeah, and DLCs sometimes. Okay, I think the last thing I should mention is what I also really like in these games is the interface and the menu. It's so fitting for the universe, and also, at least for me, the better carrot to keep playing such a game. The awards, the database, the feedback I get from the statistics, basically. It's much better than today. Oh, I unlocked this weapon now and this gimmick I can use. It's boring, basically. It's so in your face. Here it's bird in the interface, and it's, you can watch it, but you don't have to. But sadly, of course, in such a game there also is a dark side. What would you say is one of the most annoying things in this game?
There's the fact I suck at it.
There is that.
Yeah, I was absolutely terrible. I was just constantly. I think every time we had a co-op match, I'd spend more time watching Captain still flying around on the map on the observer view than I actually did playing. I was terrible.
It is an extremely difficult game to play. You have to put a fair amount of time into it to learn how to play, learn how to shoot, how to aim properly, and how to dodge, especially. And it's a very difficult game, even if you're experienced with the series.
I did not get good.
I would agree. I think that probably for me, looking back on it, is one of my biggest criticisms of it. Is that, again, there was just no real teaching or on-ramping for players, even familiar players, right? You just kind of dumped into it and to figure it out. And as I've been teaching, one of the things that I've found interesting now in my career is that when I was active in development in the industry, I just kind of, I learned what I learned along the way, and I didn't really have a lot of time to be super introspective. I mean, you just try to take what works and you move forward and you go on and you bring that into the next title. Now that I've been kind of an academic for the last 13, 14 years, I've had an opportunity to go back and really be more thoughtful about that, right? And I think it's any game that doesn't take the time to help the player acclimate to what the game is, right? I mean, I think there's a happy medium where players who are familiar with it, you don't want to slow them down by forcing them through some sort of tutorial, right? But there are methods now, and I think even back then, 25 years ago, I think we should have taken the time to create a couple of, again, training missions that, like, hey, if you're new to the game, here's how you do it, and just really slowly ramp things up. Say, start, if you've never played before, start here, do these missions first, right? And there was no real, I mean, I think there are a couple of missions that maybe were intended to do that, but again, I don't think that they were super effective. And so, looking back on it, that's my biggest criticism, was just, again, it's a huge learning curve, and it's a difficult game on top of that. And it expects you to just be able to hit the ground running, and I think that was a definite oversight on our part. And then again, I think the second con that I would have is the vanilla version not having any kind of narrative cohesiveness to it, because that was really what the expectation that we had set with the previous two games. And like I said before, I think that could have been managed better, either expectation wise and marketing, or just taking some time to put some of those levels in.
In your defense, though, going back to the sort of the tutorializing, that wasn't just you guys, was it? That was basically the 90s. That didn't happen. Everybody, you bought all games in physical copies, and you got a manual. Right. And of course, if you were younger, maybe you'd go down to the store and your parents would buy it for you, and you'd have the drive home, and you'd be sitting in the back reading the manual. So by the time you came to play the game, you had kind of encyclopedic knowledge of all the mechanics, which of course just doesn't exist anymore. So I don't think you should be too hard on yourself and the dev team in general, because I don't think anybody was doing that in the 90s.
No, I think you're right. I mean, and it was true. Or the alternative to that was you started the game and then you get like just an entire page of text, right? That tells you, here's what you're going to do, and then you go and you try to do it, right? I think as an industry we've grown a lot since then, for sure, right? But even then, right, even those facts notwithstanding, I think that we could have taken some time to do some better on-ramping, because the other games did, right? The other games had very specific training levels, and I believe that aside from going and doing like opening a tour of duty, that like we also kind of gated the experience a little bit more. Like you can't do anything other than start here, and if you finish the training missions, then it opens up other missions for you to do, right? So and that's not difficult technically to structure. You just have to be intentional with it. And like I said, it's like you get into the main menu, you get into and it's like, here's everything, pick what you want to do, and there's no real direction for a player. You can just kind of start anywhere.
They did have training missions that were carried over from TIE Fighter, but
right.
A lot of the difficulty in the game and a lot of the success in the game comes from having situational awareness of what's going on and what you have to do, and you can't really teach that in a mission. You just have to learn it from experience. So there is, a game can teach you the commands. It can teach you, move. You move by moving the joystick. You go full throttle. That's how you move around, and you press the trigger to shoot. And how much more do you need than that? But you do have to build up that situational awareness.
I guess you can't teach a tactical mindset.
Right. Well, but even then, like looking back on it, and that's almost sort of the thing that. And I agree. I mean, like there are. I think you absolutely nailed it. Like there's an aspect of it that you just have to learn through experience. But also with my level of development experience, looking back on it, I think I can conceive of ways that I could devise a mission where the outcome of that mission is to help you gain more situational awareness in a more structured, sort of safe environment, right? That's not just, and here's a shit ton of, TIE interceptors that are coming at you from every angle, right? So again, again, it's all the things that I have learned, and again, I don't necessarily regret that we did it that way. But again, it's easy to go back and look at my earlier work and go, God, I could do that so much better if I was doing that today. Right. And so I think that's a lot of what I experienced when I look back on some of these games, is I'm super proud of them for what they are, but I'm also kind of aware of some of their deficiencies, and actually even seeing some of my personal deficiencies as a young developer as opposed to a more seasoned one now.
I think one thing which really would help the game on the multiplayer side would have been a difficulty slider. There is one for the single player, but it would be nice to have one for the multiplayer where you have basically a friend who never played this game and you set the game for, well, basically Turkish shot.
Yeah.
Even in
Naming
multiplayer,
no Owens.
even in multiplayer, you can set the difficulty for the opposing side, at least. If it's mostly AI ships, you can set like a combat situation to favor one side or the other, and it doesn't you can favor your own side to make it easier that way.
In-game or in the config?
In game, there should be a setting like somewhere when you're setting up a mission in the pre-flight stage.
I think what it does is each AI, I mean, there are different levels of AI that you can give a ship, from like novice all the way up to like top ace. And I think it's like a range of like 5 or 6 that spans, how quickly they respond. It doesn't change the inherent stats of the ship, just how effectively and efficiently the AI utilizes it. And I think what the slider basically does, or what the difficulty does, is that I think on medium is the default, and that just uses whatever is currently set in the mission settings in the mission file itself. But if you set it on hard, I think it lowers the AI on your side and ups the AI on the enemy side by 1. And setting it down to easy does the opposite. It increases the AI on your side and decreases the AI on the opposite side. And I believe we also had the ability in the mission editor to say this ship only shows up on hard, or these extra ships show up on your side when you choose easy. So that was another level of balancing that we did, in addition to how many players are on one side versus another.
Does this also include the special behavior of the AI? I sometimes notice you fight for minutes with one TIE fighter, for example. You can't hit him, and out of the blue, it just flies in one straight line and you can shoot him.
I don't remember all the details of the kind of thought process behind our AI cycles. But I do remember that was something that every once in a while they would do that. And I don't know if it was based off of how long it was alive. But yeah, I'd have to reach out to Larry to ask him, because he was the one who did most of the AI work on it. So I don't know how intentional that was. Or whether that was the ideology behind it. Like, hey, after a certain amount of time, if you haven't killed it, it's just going to fly straight for a little bit of time. Because I think they do that. They would cycle through that anyway at some point. And how quickly they cycle through that is, I think, based off of their AI level. A novice fighter would tend to fly in a straight line more frequently in its choices when it was choosing its maneuvers, versus a top ace would not choose to fly in a straight line as frequently. And if they did choose to fly in a straight line, they wouldn't fly in a straight line for as long as a novice would. That I know is how it worked.
It was mostly a random thing. They would choose between a maneuver, and if you got lucky, they would fly straight, and that was your chance to really nail them.
Yep. Yeah, that's my recollection.
So the mandatory tea break.
Yeah, exactly.
One thing also not so great for a game, even back then, is that it only works with a joystick. Especially since the previous titles didn't have that restriction.
Yeah, at some point, I mean, and again, we didn't have any partnerships with any hardware manufacturers, but it was a design choice that, like, at some point, like, yep, you're just gonna, yeah, we just made the decision that, like, okay, you need a, you just need to use a joystick now, even if it was just a basic one. Yeah, that just, at some point, that just became a requirement.
It's kind of too bad too, because X-Wing and TIE Fighter, the original games in the DOS versions, they did let you use the mouse to control the ship.
Yeah.
And then in XVT's development, I guess they just said, no, we're not doing that anymore.
Yep. At some point, we just said no.
To be fair, it is a far superior way to play the actual game.
I would agree. Personally, I would agree with that. But I also look back on that too and saying, well, how many people didn't buy the game because they didn't have a joystick and didn't want to buy one?
It's kind of a cap on entry, isn't it? Yeah.
Yep.
To its credit now, most gamepads work with the game from what I hear. So, and those are really popular now because everyone has like a Steam controller or an Xbox controller and they can just plug it into their computer and play. The only downside with that is that there's so many keyboard commands that you can't really map as much as you need to the controller, so you still have to use the keyboard.
A number of years ago at the university where I work, every semester they host a LAN party, and there a good number of years ago during the LAN party I hosted an XVT kind of tournament. And exactly that. Like we just had to a lot of. I brought in my HOTAS, right? Because I'm just going to school everybody. Like I have a reputation to uphold, but yeah, everyone else had to I remember using Xbox controllers for everybody else who didn't have one. And then everybody accused me, like, well, it's not fair. You've got this great HOTAS. I'm like, no, I'm just better than you.
That is true. There's some really good people who play, like highly skilled people who can play with either the mouse or the controller. So definitely a skill issue.
Absolutely. Yep.
I mean, yeah, I was fine with the HOTAS and I still sucked.
One other issue we found during our matches is that if you have a timeout for some reason, there is no escape, basically. You can't even kill the game sometimes.
Yeah, I don't remember why. I think part of our reasoning behind that was if we didn't want someone to be like, I'm in the middle of a match and I'm losing, so I'm going to pause it on my side and make it right, because it could be unpredictable for the person who's in the middle of flying. And so it was like once you're in the middle of it, then you're in it until you're done. I think there's a way that you can still quit the mission. I want to say, but maybe I'm wrong on that. But yeah, I remember having a lot of discussion on how do we handle that situation where one person wants to quit and the other person doesn't.
Yeah, if you want to force yourself to leave, you can press Alt Q in game, and that will just drop you out from the game session.
So you could bail.
True. We didn't experience this during the match, but sometimes during the connection phase.
Oh, interesting.
Also, you can really reproduce this nicely if you click on join a TCP/IP, a local TCP/IP match, and of course there is nobody setting this up on your server end, on your LAN end. You have a timeout in 2 minutes, and escape doesn't work, Alt F4 doesn't work. So yeah, take a break.
Yeah, go make a sandwich.
I think that was just a side effect of the multiplayer technology at the time, especially like the TCP/IP connection, because it doesn't have. I've done a little bit of network programming, not a lot, but it doesn't really have a situation where it can handle errors very well. So timeout is basically the best way to know if something is not working. And I think that was just a limitation at the time, and I think it still is in some ways.
Yeah, I would agree. And that's my recollection. I actually had that happen in one of my multiplayer level design classes. We've been using Halo and the Forge editor, and there are some times when we've been trying to connect that we're all just kind of waiting, and we have to wait for it to time out before someone. I mean, at least and that you can always just Alt F4 and close the game down in the middle of it, but sometimes when connecting, there's not a lot you can do, and so you got to wait for it to time out.
One thing I also would like to mention, which is maybe not true, Random, you can surely correct me there. There is no mod support, so you can't do much compared to X-Wing Alliance.
Well, like vanilla X-Wing Alliance is basically the same thing in terms of modability. It's just that, I mean, obviously the modding scene over there really took off because of people were reverse engineering the game, and they were being able to make hooks to reprogram the game and start doing new things. But in terms of just basic modding, you could change the missions, and people who were really clever could find the stat table in the game and start changing ships and stuff. But that was basically the limit at the time.
So there is still hope for better graphics, VR support, and much more.
I think they do have VR support in X-Wing Alliance Upgrade, but not an XVT. I think it's
Yeah, not for XVT.
XVT doesn't have the community around it to do that kind of thing. Everyone's interested in X-Wing Alliance. That's where all the magic over there is happening.
Yeah, I totally know that, but I just wanted to know if there would be the possibility that we also get this, if there is a very motivated modder.
I would do it if I can, but I don't have those skills.
Yeah, and I don't know whether folks would be able to do that without having access to some of the source code. Because, like I said, we stitched so much together, from what we had just to make it work. That, again, certainly not disparaging any of the programmers that worked on it. But I think it would be difficult, I think, for the community to make significant modifications to it, because even on a mission level, I believe that if you modify your level but the other person you're playing with doesn't have that same modified level, you'll get out of sync. So like everyone has to have the exact same files, so you wouldn't be able to, even if you were able to modify it, everyone would need to have all of the same modifications in order to play. At least that's my recollection of that.
I've definitely spent a few hours helping to troubleshoot people setting up custom missions and stuff, and getting that whole experience sorted out. It takes a while to train people through it, but once you get the hang of installing missions, it's not that bad. But
right,
for like a first-time player who doesn't really know their way around the game and how the files work, it takes some explaining to do. I think that's another con of XVT, is just that being kind of the oddball of the series is that it doesn't have that much attention. There's just not a lot of people like myself who are willing to dig into it. It's the way it is, and it's mostly going to stay that way.
What I also find interesting is that this game is so innovative in the multiplayer sense, but not on the resolution side. I think the resolution was a little bit on the low end compared to other titles in 1997. I think maybe 800 by 600 would have been nice.
Yeah, I don't recall, but yeah, I know that there were limitations at the time, and even when I think they did whatever remaster, I think there were still limitations, and so we never had like a super high, resolution that we offered for that. I think Alliance, handles that better now, but XVT just didn't.
Yeah, for XVT, well, this is true of the earlier games too. The original X-Wing and TIE Fighter, is that the cockpits are all hand-drawn. Well, I don't know if they're hand-drawn, but they're all two-dimensional artwork.
Right.
So there's no way to scale them up. The art team has to make a new cockpit for each resolution. And obviously that, you're adding a lot of overhead to that. And when X-Wing Alliance was released, they had switched to 3D cockpits at that time, and just a simple overlay for all of your text stuff. And that made it easier to scale for higher resolutions than something like XVT, which was kind of just locked in at 640 by 480.
Right, because that was the resolution that the cockpit was drawn in.
Then my last two things would basically be that the game doesn't really tell you when the mission is really, really finished. Sometimes you get the notification, you're done, you can go home. Then you wait for half a minute or a minute. Oh, there's happening stuff, more and more. Okay, when is the mission really finished then?
I think the messaging system will cycle through at the end for the radio messages at the top. Once you've completed the mission, that it'll eventually cycle through that. I do remember having some missions that I designed and ones that Dave designed, that there were times when we wanted to encourage you to leave, like, hey, the mission's over, so now I'm going to start spawning a whole bunch of Star Destroyers, right? But then the problem with that is the community is like, cool, challenge accepted, I will destroy these Star Destroyers, right? Rather than using it as motivation to leave the mission. But yeah, I think sometimes communicating with more clarity, at least XVT could have improved that as well.
Yeah, all they had was a goal screen. You could open the goal screen and see whether you had actually finished the mission or not, and that was basically the only way you could tell if you were done and if you could leave the mission and have it be a success.
Right.
True, but even then, when there is everything done, you also have the message successful. Basically, there's still stuff happening, which is, of course, great. It's also a pro, I would say, but it's strange. It leaves you a little bit on a strange edge.
I think that came over from TIE Fighter, because TIE Fighter was set up to have primary goals and you had secondary goals and bonus objectives. So your primary goals were usually pretty quick. You could finish those in like 5 or 10 minutes. But to do all the bonuses, you might have to stick around for like 20 or 30 minutes, because there's always like more stuff happening, more stuff coming in to inspect, more stuff coming in that you had to destroy. So there's a lot of stuff in TIE Fighter like that.
That's definitely true, because anytime that the mission structure added more features from title to title, that got moved forward. I mean, because again, even that's even true. So once if you look at the file structure for the mission structure in X-Wing, and then you compare that to what options are there, again, like, primary, secondary, bonus goals in TIE Fighter. So that carried forward into X-Wing versus TIE Fighter, and whatever other additional things, like something being captured, or like different states that we added, that then got moved forward and incorporated into X-Wing Alliance as well. So Random's right. I mean, that's the structure of that was just a continuation from the previous titles.
And basically my last thing, which I never considered before, you can also say it's a pro, but for some noobs definitely not. There's an overload on missions. If you open the game for the first time, holy cow, what should I play as a noob first?
And that's kind of gets back to my thinking that I think there's a better way we could have kind of gated the content a little bit more. So, players who are first playing, like, hey, do this first and then start here, right? And giving players, I don't know, either an option, like experienced players an option, like, hey, just unlock everything and jump in. Or if like new players like start, right, and do these training missions, then, do this multiplayer mission, and right, kind of a better way to structure that experience. So yeah, because it doesn't become like a deer in the headlights. Like, here's all these things, I don't even know where to start. I think that's definitely a con.
There's the last con I can basically get in for the game is that a lot of people playing this game do have trouble on modern systems, but there are community fixes for getting like the graphics compatibility to work. The sound usually has a lot of issues on modern computers, and if you're playing multiplayer, a lot of people go through a game ranger and they have problems with, they have to set up port forwarding on their router to be able to play, because like this is old, internet connectivity tech. So there is a significant learning curve to some people just to get the compatibility fixes applied and getting the games running. But on the pro, like once you can get into it, and if you can get past all of that and really get into the game and enjoy it, it's a very good game.
When we launched, we had a partnership with Microsoft, and the MSN Gaming Zone was the main interface that people used to connect to each other. And I don't remember how long the MSN Gaming Zone lasted, but I mean, at some point that site shut down, and I was fairly convinced, like that's the end, right? Like, shut off the lights, like make sure you lock the doors when you leave, that was going to be it for the life of the game. So the fact that people have found, that the community has continued it and found solutions to allow people to, I mean, it's lived on far longer than I expected. I think than any of us expected to. The fact that people still play it, I'm thrilled by that. I'm thrilled by the community's dedication to continue to find a way to keep playing this game. That was certainly never designed or intended to be played the way that it's been being played today.
Well, I mean, in some ways it was, because back then, like, all you could do to play a game was to share your IP address and say, I'm hosting, come join.
Yep.
And that's still how it is today. So, well, you can automate it through Game Ranger, but that's still essentially the core feature, is that you have to give your IP to someone and have them connect. And I mean, the one benefit of that is that there's no servers for it. Like, I mean,
Right.
how old? I mean, it's a con that there's no servers. You can't just go and see that there's a game open and join it. But in the modern day, you don't need a server. You can just connect to somebody else if they're hosting a
Right.
game. And 30 years after the fact, we can still play this. And
Yeah.
it's a con for other games that are released too, because maybe even something like Squadrons, because they don't have direct connect, they don't have LAN play. So
Yeah.
that is a strength of XVT, just for
Right.
being able to play this no matter what.
Yeah, don't get me started on games as a service.
Yeah.
Or the last final Windows version.
Right.
Yeah. I'm sure we're all looking forward to Windows 12. Sorry, I'm sidetracking.
This game actually does work in Linux. You can do it direct IP. You can run it under Wine in Linux and do direct
Oh,
IP games. That does work. I've done it.
A big pro.
It'll live forever.
Sidetracking again, that just made me think, do any of you guys know of Ross Scott?
I'm not familiar with him.
He's a YouTuber. He got picked up got recognized mostly for a series he did called Freeman's Mind, where he did kind of comedic voiceover on playthroughs of Half-Life.
Oh, cool.
And he's got an entire series on his channel called Dead Game News, which is specifically about games that are dying because the servers they run on are being switched off.
Wow.
And that's it. You bought the game, you can't play it anymore because the support is gone. And it's not just for multiplayer games, of course. There are some games that require servers for what's called anti-piracy measures or for whatever reason. But anything that requires an always-on, games are just dying. So he does a roundup about once a month. Right, this game's gone, this game's gone, this game's gone. You can't play this anymore. So yeah, it's an absolute delight that XVT is never going to be featured there.
That's great.
Using this as the first unique thing this game offers. Another thing I never have seen in a game from that era especially is that fans wrote basically fan fictions for the missions and the game. It's really amazing.
Yeah, there's
Yeah,
entire communities about that, like
Yeah.
Renegade Wing.
yeah. And that to me is like, again, I knew of that. I mean, I was part of that even before joining the dev team, and I think maybe that speaks more to Star Wars fandom in general than it does specifically to the game, right? I mean, I think the game attracts the people who want to have that pilot experience, right? And I always found it interesting, that there are communities that write fan fiction related to it. But I mean, fan fiction is something I know it's not related or exclusively to this game or this series. I know there are other people who do similar in other gaming groups and other titles and other games.
That's true, but for comparison, I'm very big in the Star Trek community, integrated in the gaming community, and there's nothing compared to this.
Oh, interesting. Huh.
So I never experienced that. Of course, fan fiction is as old as fandom,
Right.
but in a game, really nice.
But I think that is definitely a unique aspect of the series for sure.
That could have sprang up from having mission editors around, because mission editors were released for a long time. They're almost as old as the games themselves. So
Yeah.
if you had internet access and you could download an editor, you could just start making missions for it. And if you're making missions, of course, you need a storyline. And if you need a storyline, might as well write some fan fiction.
Yeah.
And I guess the game earns also the title of the first space combat game with a co-op mod. Was there anything else? Do you know any guys?
I don't know if, as far as a space combat game, maybe we were the first. I mean, I can think of other games. It's not necessarily a space combat game. I think there was a game called Descent that let you play cooperatively. Gosh, I don't remember, because I mean, I know you could play Descent competitively, right, in kind of a deathmatch mode. Because actually, we used to play it at LucasArts like at 5 o'clock when everyone would the telephone lines would be shut off, and then the whole company would be playing like Descent or Doom or Quake or something like that. But I think there may have been others. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but yeah, that may have been a unique aspect that you could play co-op.
I'm not very familiar with other space games, but I mean, XVT released in 97, so that
Yeah.
I mean, that was pretty early. I mean, I know there's another game released called Tachyon the Fringe that released in
Oh, yeah.
2000, but I mean, that was a few years later when you had,
Right.
fancy 3D stuff. And
But did this have multiplayer?
I think that game did. I've never played it.
But I think at least the Wing Commander genre didn't do anything co-op. But the resident expert can say more to that.
Oh well, so this is where we get to bring in my other great shame coming into this forum, as well as not being particularly X-wing versus Tie Fighter averse or organized. I'm not particularly involved in multiplayer either. I'm very much a narrative guy. This is why I'm the perfect foil for this conversation. So yeah, I know. We're Jedi. When you mentioned earlier, you think there was a Wing Commander game that was doing multiplayer around the same time. That was probably Wing Commander Armada.
Oh, no,
But
that's what it was. Yep.
yeah, but because I'm not a multiplayer pro myself, I've never actually played it, so I don't know if it was only PvP or if there was any PvE in there. So sorry, Captain. Got to put my hands up there and say, nah, I don't know.
Oh, okay. And also your fellow developers at the Wing Commander Remastered project also don't know that or mentioned it.
I wanted to mention that. So we've had a conversation about our project with Captain before, and I now just refer to him as Captain Co-op Sidaris, because the question you kept asking was, is there possibly going to be a co-op mode? And our lead developer just sort of silently banging his head against the desk. Because all the conversation you guys were having about networking, and especially Jedi, when you said, the things like the model predicting where it thinks you're likely to go in case it desyncs, and then when it resyncs you might leap somewhere else. This, of course, none of this is in any of the stuff we've built. So when someone just raises their hand and says, any chance of a co-op in there? It's like, shut. Don't ask.
That's funny.
Don't worry. During our next interview, I will mention it again.
So any progress on that co-op, guys? Shut up.
But moving a little bit to the future, what would you guys say should a sequel do? What would you like on the feature side?
Well, it's kind of funny. I feel like Squadrons is a real kind of spiritual sequel to it, even if the mission selection in that game is somewhat limited for multiplayer. I had the great kind of pleasure and fortune of a colleague of mine from my later career was also a mutual colleague of the project lead on Squadrons. And he kind of introduced the two of us, and we had a chance to chat. And it's very clear to me that Squadrons is kind of a love letter to XVT, and Ian Fraser, the project lead on Squadrons, had intimated that, like, even while they were developing the Starfighter part of I think Battlefront, it was that they wanted to make this game, and that XVT was a big influence on Squadrons. Again, I mean, just the fact that for me, again, obviously, like, VR support would be a critical part of that, and Squadrons has that. A single player story campaign or a cooperative campaign would be something. Again, I mean, I think that when we added the Balance of Power expansion, I think that addressed a lot of that concern, and I think we did that really well. But in some sort of a sequel, for me, better onboarding for the player, better player teaching, better gating of the content, and inherently having some narrative aspect that the players could engage in that would also do storytelling as well. That's what I would want to see.
Yeah, the main complaint from Squadrons that I've seen just listening to people talk about it is that there's no way to make missions. People want to be able to make more content, and people have to be able to do that. And I think if there's going to be a sequel, it really needs to just embrace the aspect, like do something like what StarCraft did with a fully featured mission editor, where you can just make stuff, you can set up all the triggers, you can set up scripting. Like, people want to be able to do that.
Yep, same.
And the other thing too is just make a good co-op experience, a good single player. Just make needs to be good single player, good multiplayer, a good co-op experience that you can play with your friends, and just quality of life features. Just maybe some more targeting functions to help you figure stuff out in a chaotic battle or something like that. Like, that's just all people really want, is they want content and to play it and to enjoy it.
I would definitely add to this more customization for each battle. For example, in RTS titles, you can, or at least in some, you can really customize how the match even starts, what weapons are used, how many ships they're in, how many big ships, how many small ships. You could add so much more there. That in combination with a map editor or even mod support would be amazing.
Absolutely. Those will all be great things to have.
On a side note here, I always had a problem with Squadrons. I bought it directly at release because I thought, hey, finally we get something I can use a joystick again. And I spent over an hour to set everything up. It was so tedious. And then I wasn't really happy with the feeling. It was so strange, so sluggish, and I never touched it again. If I maybe switch to mouse targeting, it would be better.
Had a similar experience with Squadrons in that, again, as I mentioned earlier, I thought it looked gorgeous, but I could not kind of click with the controls. And again, that might be Wing Commander having ruined all my instincts. But yeah, I did a similar thing. I really wanted to get into it. Again, like I said, I'm a narrative game player. I really wanted to follow the story, see where that went and everything. But I just found that I was just constantly frustrated, so I stopped, which was a shame. But that's very much me, I suspect, and not the game itself.
Well, I had the same experience, and I know all the controls of X-Wing. So, not really. Another thing I hope the new title doesn't learn from Squadrons is, please don't give us forced matchmaking. Give us some direct IP connections, something that the game will stay alive forever.
I've never actually played Squadrons, so I can't comment on how it did as a sequel. My computer's just too old for that.
Not always a bad thing.
Nope.
Okay, then I would say let's switch to the last topic, hidden content. I'm curious, what have you found? I found 3 Easter eggs, but maybe there are more.
I know for me, any of the Easter eggs that I put in there were very specific to the community I was in. So like things from our like ships that we used in our fan fiction, part of the like capital ships that were unique to our community. Right, I'd always sneak those in any opportunity that I had.
Oh, fantastic.
References to things that that were inside jokes with our community, right? And so I think that was one of the things that was kind of not only fun for me to be able to do that, and I can't think of specifics now, unfortunately, because it was so long ago. But there's a lot of little things like that. I mean, we would put names of our friends in, but we would spell them backwards, right? Like all sorts of stuff like that. We would sneak in. I know there's a ton of undocumented things like that. I mean, that just fills the game everywhere you look. So whatever you guys manage to find or connections you're able to make, good on you, because it's definitely full of them.
So what did everyone else find? Like, I made a list of things that I found during my time, but I'll see what you got first.
Well, I just used the power of Google, and I would like a confirmation. Is there really a Star Destroyer in-game which orders a pizza?
Yes.
Yep. I was looking at that before the show. I was trying to find which mission that was, but yes, there's a warhead interception mission, and if you look at the mission in the mission editor, it's triggered to arrive 29 minutes in. So yep, there is a galactic pizza delivery.
Yes, and I believe that's one of my missions.
I really have to record this, even though I guess I will need help with the intercepting duty. It was hard. I tried it today a few times.
Yeah, that's definitely in there. I forgot about that. Holy smokes.
Then there are some credits on the eject button.
Oh, yep. If you take critical damage, if you're playing a rebel ship that has the eject button, because Imperial ships don't have eject, I guess, but if you're flying a rebel ship and your hull gets critically damaged and the buzzer starts going off and you wait about a minute, it'll start scrolling through some credits.
Oh, that's probably a bug. I don't think that's not an intended feature. You found a great bug. That's fantastic.
No, it's got to be a feature. Nothing like that happens on accident.
I don't know. There's some wacky stuff that we had that we may not have caught. I wouldn't be surprised if that was a bug.
But you were talking about missions. There's another one I found. Let's see, there's a mission called Attack on Rebel Capital Ships, and if you wait about 12 minutes after the Rebel side leaves and you're playing on medium difficulty, there's some cruisers that show up. There's a cruiser Randall Flag that jumps in, which I guess is a character that Stephen King created, and there's like a cruiser Exterminator that jumps in, and there's a Star Destroyer that jumps in called Dead Meat, and a bunch of ships, I guess, just arrive and destroy the Star Destroyer.
That sounds like one of Dave's missions. I did a lot of the Rebel ones. I think he did a lot of the Imperial-focused ones.
There's also a special thank you on the map view. If you hit a certain combination of keys, it should show up.
Yep, you have the map screen open and the little help panel that shows the key commands is open. If you press like insert, delete, home, and page up, page down, you can see different messages for special thanks, like more credits and stuff like that.
And the last one I found at least was a product of its time, I guess. Oh my god, they killed Kenny.
Yeah, I remember that. I think that was one of Dave's missions as well. He was big into South Park. I also know of a mechanical Easter egg that's absolutely still in there. It's really hard to test, but it is in there, and it only came with balance of power when we added the Super Star Destroyer. If you take out the shield generators on the Super Star Destroyer and you're in an A-Wing, if you fly the A-Wing towards the bridge superstructure and aim the A-Wing towards the superstructure, if you eject and the A-Wing spins out of control and hits the bridge, it will take out the Super Star Destroyer in one shot. So that I know is still in there. Someone a few years ago, I was talking about, and they went and they tested it, and they said, yeah, no, that still works. I'm like, cool.
Yeah, I was wondering if you mentioned that one, because someone mentioned that in a Discord to me a couple weeks ago, and I'm like, I should test this, and it does work. Yeah. It is there.
Yep, that is absolutely there. That was very intentional.
There's a couple more that just small Easter eggs, kind of like the credits thing. If you let the opening cutscene play when you first launch the game and you go into the credits, when the credit screen is open, if you press Alt-Shift F12, you'll see some photos from the dev team.
Oh, cool. I didn't even remember that.
If you play a melee and you exit the game and you're back in the debrief screen, if you go to the mission overview tab and you hold Alt, Shift, and Control at the same time, you'll see a guy. I don't know who it is, maybe you might know, but he's holding up a model of an X-Wing and a TIE fighter in his hands.
Does he have a mustache and glasses?
I would have to check.
You'd have to find it. Yeah, that might be Bucky. It sounds like
he does have no mustache, but he does have glasses.
Oh, maybe it's a picture of Larry then. Now I'm gonna have to go back and do some of these myself to remember some of these pictures. I totally forgot that we had pictures hidden in there too. That's great.
Like, the easy way to see them is to just go into there's a folder in the game that stores all of the assets. You can just go in there and find the photos there, but there is a way to see them in game.
Oh, that's funny.
I'm looking through my install folder now trying to find them.
Yeah.
It's in front res if you're looking for it. It's in
thank you.
vanilla XVT
cool.
folder.
Bitmaps, yeah, got them. Nice one. I'll have a look through in a bit.
There's an image in there that says "Beware, Albert, beware." So I don't know what that's a reference to. And
I'm sure it was Albert was one of our programmers. He's a fantastic guy. He's and probably one of the sweetest guys, just one of the nicest guys you could ever meet. And I don't necessarily know the reference to Beware Albert, but that sounds, like he and Larry were super close, and so I would not be surprised if that was something that Larry snuck in, just like, I'll get you back, like if you took me out in a bunch of missions or in multiplayer, like Beware, because I'm gonna come and get you. So that tracks.
There's one last message too. In the bottom of the README file, if you scroll all the way down to the end, it's a text file. It says Dan is still the king. So might that be a reference?
Yep. That's our would be Dan Connors, who was our lead, who was our QA lead at the time, and he was a really, really great pilot. I'm looking through the images, and the picture of the guy with the X-wing and the TIE fighter. That's Larry.
Yeah, that's pretty much all the stuff I have for hidden features that you guys have also not mentioned.
Oh yeah, that's funny.
Well, guys, I would say that's it for this video. Thank you for joining us. It was really amazing talking to you guys, and Jedi, thank you for doing all this amazing work.
Well, I am one cog in a much larger wheel, and I really appreciate you inviting me for the chat. It was a fun kind of trip down memory lane, and I've had a lot of fun sharing my experience with you guys.
It's always good hearing from developers of games, so just listening in on this, I was very entertained.
Oh, great.
Oh yeah, no, this has been so much fun. Thank you very much.
Usually for one of my favorite games, so I do have some investment in listening about it.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm glad you guys had fun.
Well, I would say this is the part of the video where I open also the mic to you guys. Is there anything you want to mention before we leave?
Oh, well, I was just going to say, I guess the only thing I'd like to say is I apologise for being so bad at the game and not being able to explore more of it before we had this conversation.
There's still time to play.
That's right.
Oh, I'm sure I will do. Yeah, I know Cap's going to want to carry on doing our co-op missions. It's been fun, even though I felt utterly inadequate. It's been enjoyable, so I'm sure we'll play more.
Oh, definitely.
But I guess anything that I would have to say is I feel like I could probably speak for the team again, for wherever we are in the world right now. That we really appreciate that the community is still active, that there are people who still enjoy the game and are trying to maintain it and, find ways of extending its life, and especially like the communities around it, the mod communities. I mean, the X-Wing Alliance upgrade team. I mean, I've downloaded their upgrade because their models are so good. I never would have imagined that, like, literally 25 years later, people would still be playing this game, right? I mean, like, I'm an old guy now, and there's still people who play it, and that's just super, super thrilling to me. I never would have imagined it. And so for everybody who plays it and enjoys it and continues to have a community around it, I think that's just thrilling, and I know that means a lot to the team.
Okay, then I say that's it for this review. Leave us a comment, tell us what you think about the game, and of course, play the game. Until next time, bye bye.